Hi, everybody. I'm AJ Baime. It's great to be with you. I want to thank the great author Alex Kershaw for inviting me. Thank you, Holly Rotondi and Max at the Friends of the World War II Memorial. I'm here to talk about my book, The Accidental President, which came out in 2017. I've written a bunch of books about World War II and other things, and this has been my biggest labor of love and by far my bestseller. So, let's jump into it. Years ago, I grew up as a young lad in the state of New Jersey, and my father was a judge. And he had this portrait on the wall of this old man who I thought was a distant relative. And I remember asking him about it because I kept thinking, like, this portrait has been up in my home all my life, and I don't know who this person is. So I'll ask. And my father said, that's Harry Truman. And he said he was the first great president from the common people. And my father thought that was very important because he was a judge and we lived in a small house in a nice little town. And the idea that he wanted to impress upon me was greatness can come from anywhere, from unexpected places. You don't have to be a very rich person. You don't have to be an extraordinarily successful person in life to find greatness within yourself. Sometimes fate can thrust it upon you. And you have to reach deep inside yourself and find that greatness. And that's the lesson I took away from it. Years ago, I started reading David McCullough's wonderful biography. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there listening who have read that biography, and I found something in there that I wanted to write about. And I'd just written this book called The Arsenal of Democracy, which some of you might have read. That was a New York Times bestseller about my first book about World War II, and there was all this material in there that I learned about Harry Truman that really shocked me. And the one thing that shocked me the most was that here was this guy who was an extraordinarily obscure senator, a very obscure vice president, who became president by accident. And I woke up one night and the title, The Accidental President, literally came to me at 2:00 in the morning. And I had this idea to write about the first 4 months of the Truman administration. And the thesis would be that the first 4 months of the Truman administration were the most action-packed of any presidency in American history. And you might say, well, really? And what we're going to do today is run through that 4 months and give you a basic understanding of what the book is about and what Harry Truman was up against during those days. My father, who was a judge like Harry Truman, great Democrat like Harry Truman, when I told him that I wanted to write about Truman, he was kind of stunned and he said, you can't do that. And I said, Dad, why not? And he said, McCullough. And he thought that McCullough's biography was so extraordinary and so thorough that that was the last word, that nobody ever had to write about Truman again. And it was dangerous to do so. But by this time I was already on my way. And this book has done very well. It's nothing like McCullough's biography. It's really, the whole book is about 4 months. I want to talk about the setup of this book. When you look at this picture, you see Harry Truman as a young man. He's a farmer in Missouri from 1906 to 1917. That's a long time in a young man's life. He farmed in obscurity. His letters survive from these days, and it's easy sort of to get inside his head. What is he thinking about in this moment? And I love the symbolism of this photograph, because when you look at it, here's this young man looking at it, this horizon that never ends. He's a farmer, obscure, living obscurely in Missouri, and he has great passions. He loves politics. He's a huge reader, but he doesn't believe that there's anything in store for him in his life except what you see in this photo. He's in love with this young woman named Bess who will have nothing to do with him, and he doesn't think there's anything out there for him. Then suddenly Truman ends up a captain in the war, partly because of his age. He was already, 31 when he goes to war. And one of the wonderful things about researching Truman or any president is that there's so much material. Just as an example, when Harry Truman goes to war, he takes command of Battery D, this bunch of guys, and he's thrust into leadership, and he's terrified. And when you research presidents, or, all kinds of important people right here in America, one of the things I love about our country is that all the presidential documents belong to the American people. And even, private diaries and oral histories and things like that is a little more complicated, but all of that exists at the Truman Library. So when Truman goes to war, he's still this, he's 30 now. All these people surrounding him kept diaries, and all of them later were interviewed for oral histories. And they talk about the utter fear that he felt when he stood in front of Battery D to take command for the first time. This was a man who was not accustomed to leadership, who had no knowledge that he had that leadership potential in him. And this is the first time that he realized that there might be more to himself than he realizes. But still, he's back in Kansas City, Missouri now. And he opens a store. And I love this picture. You can see Truman on the left here of your screen. This is Truman and Jacobson. So he comes back and he starts this store in Kansas City with, he says, my great Jewish friend, Eddie Jacobson. The point I want to make about this picture, so extraordinary. You see the ties hanging out. He's selling ties. He's selling socks. He's selling men's hats. This small store goes belly up. And again, he thinks, there's nothing out there for me. He's a failure in business, never really made it anywhere in life with these quick, rich schemes. So in 1922, that's when he's 38, suddenly this thing happens where he falls into politics almost by accident because he has nothing else to do and he's got to make a paycheck. And in Jackson County, there's a guy named Pendergast who says, basically, Harry, if you run for this judgeship, we'll back you. And he wins and he becomes a judge. Small time, county judge. The office building still exists in Independence, Missouri. I encourage people to go see it when you go see the newly renovated Truman Library, which is extraordinary. But the office is still there. 2 years later, Truman loses. So now it's 1924. He's out of a job. And still, this guy, he's a failure at everything he does. And he thinks there's nothing out there for me. It's not until 1934, he's 50 now. Think about that. Think about your own age. Think about what you were doing at 50 years old. And suddenly Truman goes to Washington. And through these events that unfold, which I can only describe as uncanny, inscrutable, unbelievable, you have to think that fate is indeed at work to land him here in this picture. This is obviously a famous picture. I know a lot of you have seen it before. You see the First Lady here. You see Margaret, the Truman's only daughter. Admiral Leahy is pictured here. Chief of Staff of the White House, Sam Rayburn, is all the way on your right. The small bald guy, Speaker of the House. So the day comes, April 12th, 1945, and I spend the first 32 pages of The Accidental President on this one day. And Truman is planning this poker game, and he's going to meet his buddies. He tells his buddy, Eddie, to go get the whiskey and the ice, and they're going to meet for this poker game. And all of a sudden, he's in Sam Rayburn's office. It's just about 5 o'clock. They pour the drinks. They plop the ice in there, and the phone rings. And Truman is asked to go to the White House, and he knows something's up. And he starts sprinting through the Capitol building. I mean, you can hear the sound of his footsteps. He's scared something's going on, but he doesn't know what. And he ends up getting a car to the White House where Mrs. Roosevelt puts her arm around his shoulder and says the president is dead. And Harry Truman says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she says, "No, Harry. Is there anything I can do for you? Because you are the one in trouble now." This is Margaret Truman speaking right here when he is inaugurated president. She says, "If I ever felt the awesome dimensions of history, it was in that room that night." Now, I want to just talk a little bit about the shock to the country. The cabinet assembles for this event, this inauguration. Some people wrote in their diaries what they felt and what they saw that night. This is Jonathan Daniels, who was the press secretary. He talks about walking into the White House and finding Truman sitting in a chair. He says, "In the long cabinet room, Truman looked like a little man as he sat waiting in a huge leather chair." This is Joseph Davies, who was in the State Department at that time, a very high-level official. He wrote in his diary, "The cabinet was assembling. All was confusion. The shock of the tragedy was very evident. Everyone seemed more or less numb. There was one fact which impressed me very much, and that was the grief which could be found in the faces of even the hard-boiled news and radio men. Their faces were set. In some instances, tears streamed down the faces of men who obviously were exercising all of their will to maintain self-control." Now, all over the world on this night when Truman becomes this accidental president, people are freaking out. and they're writing in their diaries. Eisenhower in Europe is writing in his diary. Churchill in London is writing his diary. And of course, we have all those diaries, so we know what people were thinking. And I quote extensively any number of them so people can get a sense of the shock to the country and the fear. Because you have to understand, of course, Franklin Roosevelt had been president for, 3 terms and 82 days. Many people living in America, particularly soldiers, were young enough that they couldn't really remember a time in American history when there was any other president but Franklin Roosevelt. He had gone to the best schools. He had led the country through the Great Depression, into the war, and it appeared now by this time that we were going to win the war. And Franklin Roosevelt had done all of that. People knew nothing about Harry Truman. Here's a couple entries in diaries from that night. This is Michigan Senator Arthur Vandenberg. The gravest question mark in every American heart is about Truman. Can he swing the job? Here's Winston Churchill. He received the news, quote, as if I had been struck by a physical blow. Indeed, it may be said that Roosevelt died at the supreme climax of the war and at a moment when his authority was mostly needed to guide the policy of the United States. And here's Omar Bradley over in Europe. None of us knew Truman or much about him. He came from my home state, Missouri, but I had to confess almost complete ignorance. So nobody knew anything about this guy, and that's the setup for this book. Because when he walks into the White House, I spend quite a bit of time talking about when he gets home that night. He's made a sandwich. He lives in this small, very, very humble apartment on Connecticut Avenue with his wife and daughter. A neighbor comes over and gives him a ham sandwich. He's this ordinary man, and nobody knows what's up with him. And there's this amazing scene. There is a Netflix type of series that is being developed off The Accidental President. And there's going to be this great moment because to me, I cried when I did this research, when I found this moment. Like he comes home, he's now president, and Truman had this tremendous ability to fall asleep at any moment of stress. He was really good at it. Me, not so much. But he, in a moment of stress, he could fall asleep. And it was actually a great talent because he needed sleep and he needed rest. But that night, he wakes up in the middle of the night and he looks over. He and his wife kept separate beds, as was normal at the time. And in the middle of the night, he wakes up and he looks over and he sees and he hears his wife sobbing alone in her bed. And all he can think about is he's got to wake up in the morning and face the music. He's now the most powerful man in the history of the world. Here you see Henry Stimson. He's the Secretary of War. Great man. Fascinating figure. We have all of his diaries. They exist at Yale University in the Rare Manuscript Library. Some of them you can find online. But there's this amazing meeting between the two men. This picture doesn't depict the moment, but I'm showing it to you so you get a feeling of who they are and what they look like and the feeling of the time. But after Truman is inaugurated, right after, he gets pulled into a private room by the Secretary of War, Stimson, and he's told the secret, but he's only told a little bit. He says, we have this weapon. I can't tell you anything about it. And Truman is thinking, well, I'm now the president of the United States. Shouldn't I know? And it's really not until the next day. So the first night Truman becomes president, he has no knowledge of the Manhattan Project. He doesn't know the bomb project even exists. Okay, so when we begin talking about the first 4 months of the Truman administration, I mean, the events are just shocking and they happen so quickly. So I'll just read to you just a couple of minutes from my notes, a couple of seconds. April 13th is Truman's first full day in office. He meets with his cabinet for the first time. On this same day, Major General Curtis LeMay's 21st Bomber Command firebombs Japan. Thousands of civilians are killed. On April 14th, the next day, is Roosevelt's funeral. And you're looking at a picture of it here. Again, the shock, the awe, the fear, the sense that this patriarchal figure all over the world was gone and no one was there to help us. April 16th, Truman addresses Congress for the first time as president. And what a moment that was. Can you imagine the stress that this man faced, this ordinary man who everybody expected to fail? He has to address Congress. The whole world is watching. And there's this amazing moment. I tear up when I think about this. He stands up on the lectern, he begins to speak, and he looks up and he sees his wife and daughter. And his wife is crying in the audience for any number of reasons, because FDR was dead, because her husband was in this situation that's felt impossible to survive. She was tremendously fearful. And there she is, listening to her husband address Congress and the world. And she's crying. Of course, we have the speech, and we have the reaction in the press, and we have the reaction of everybody in the room who, in those eras before television and the distractions of our cell phones, kept diaries. And the reaction was extraordinary and very positive. So here you see FDR's funeral. Truman rides a train with the casket up to Hyde Park, where FDR is buried and where his body remains. A lot is happening in Europe. So here you see the fall of Berlin. Looks like at this point we're going to win the war, but we're not done yet. And there's a lot to be figured out. But mass destruction in Europe, a refugee crisis is beginning. And one of the interesting things that happens, like right around the time Truman becomes president, right after, our troops meet the Soviet troops. They're coming from the east. We're coming from the west, and we meet. And this is a turning point for the world war, but also for the history of the world, in which suddenly the Soviets and the Americans meet for the first time, and we're awkward allies, and it's going to be very strange. Very quickly after Truman becomes president, on the April 25th, the United Nations Conference begins. And this is a conference, this has been going on forever, trying to figure out how this United Nations is going to work. Now the leaders of 50 nations have come to San Francisco to have this conference in which they're going to decide how this organization is going to work, what the power structure will be, what is its function. This took months and months to work out, and suddenly it's starting to fall into place. And Harry Truman, the new president, has to go out to San Francisco, address the conference, address the world in this one of many, many, many historical moments. And he's still just getting up to speed. In this picture, you can see him with the Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, who did a lot to get the United Nations Charter completed. And Truman is a success. He addresses the United Nations, and the UN is founded. It still exists today, and we're still arguing over its power structure. We're still arguing over what its function should be. The firebombing of Tokyo happened, it was March 10th. I'm writing a book about this now, about our airplanes over Japan, the B-29s. And there's a lot I can say about it. But the important thing I want to say at this point is, right when Truman becomes president, this is happening. We're firebombing Japan. And nothing like this has really happened in the history of the world. Shockingly, these operations were strictly military, and there's not a lot of information in the Truman files about how he's reacting to this, to our conduct of war. The Secretary of War is even concerned that we're going too far, we're killing too many civilians. But as all this unfolds, halfway through the first 4 months of Truman's administration, on June 18, he holds this critical meeting in the White House. Here you have Secretary of the military, George Marshall, who Truman, revered among all other figures. And all these other military figures sit down and they come to this table and they start planning a ground invasion of Japan. And Marshall estimates what the casualties will be, and they are shocking. And from the point of view of aviation, of the air leaders in the Army and the United States Air Forces, and particularly the 20th Air Force, commanded by Henry Hap Arnold, there's this sense that if we really destroy Japan, we can get the war done before this invasion happens, and we won't lose all those American soldiers, but it's very controversial. So how's the president going to respond to this? Obviously, the death camps are being liberated. I have a quote here I want to read. So on April 15th, this is 3 days after Truman becomes president, the British Second Army reached Bergen-Belsen. What they found there defied description. According to the Second Army's commander, General Miles Dempsey, quote, "Anything you have seen doesn't even begin the story." A reporter for the Chicago Tribune wrote, "There were children, 500 of them, in the midst of this. Babies were born here daily." During the same week, the Allies liberated Nazi death camps at Dora Mittelbau, Buchenwald, Westerbork. So the curtain from Hitler's most horrible secret is getting pulled away. before the world. Obviously, we knew what was happening to the Jews there for quite a long time. But when these camps were liberated, the world is in shock. I want to read Edward R. Murrow speaking over CBS Radio. He says, "And now let me tell you in the first person, quote, God alone knows how many men and boys have died there during the last 12 years. At Buchenwald, they spoke of the president just before he died. If there be a better epitaph, history does not record it." So now Harry Truman is the president, and he has to respond to these events. Not long after Truman becomes president, Hitler commits suicide, and the Germans are defeated. Mussolini as well. Shockingly, if you look online, you will find the actual footage of Mussolini's execution. It's pretty grim, and I chose not to share it with you today. The capture of some of the arch war criminals. Again, the president of the United States has to figure out what to do with these people. Here's Hermann Göring, another fascinating figure. And there was a certain amount of joy in writing of justice when the Americans capture these criminals. And it's up to Truman to figure out, to begin to lay the foundation to figure out what we're going to do with these people. In the beginning of the Nuremberg trials, the planning, it begins. In the Far East, what we're doing with the 20th Air Force and with our Marines and Army and Navy is conquering these small islands. And a lot of people today, I find when I talk about World War II, they don't really understand. They understand how heroic these battles were. Okinawa, young people know right away, very important, but they don't really understand why it was that we wanted to take this little island. And it's critical. What our strategy in the Far East is to capture these islands and create airfields and bases that are close enough to mainland Japan so that our bombers can reach there. And you have to understand that right when we take Guam, we have Tinian, we have Saipan, and we have Okinawa. This happens at the precise time, right about the same time that the B-29s are coming off the assembly line big time. These are the first airplanes with compressed cabins, with remote control turrets, the state-of-the-art, real weapon systems. And just consider for a moment that the B-29 cost American taxpayers $3 billion, and the Manhattan Project cost $2.1. These are very expensive weapon systems, and we were going to use them to destroy Japan. But first, we had to capture these small islands in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific that we could use as air bases. So these B-29s and fighters to escort them could reach the Japanese mainland. So all of this is happening in the first 4 months of Truman's administration. On April 12, 1945, the world's in shock. People really don't know who this guy is. They don't know what he stands for. They don't know his politics. They don't know really anything about him. He had never been the mayor of a city, never the governor of a state. He did not graduate college. He had never had the money to own his own home. And this was the man who was filling the shoes of Roosevelt. And over the 4 months, with all of this historical stuff happening, you see this extraordinary narrative begin to emerge from the White House. People are seeing Truman, they're listening to Truman, and they can relate to him. They understand where he's coming from. He speaks very plainly. There's this sense of justice to him. There's a real sense of patriotism. This is a man who's served his country in war. But also, America begins to see the man Harry, not just the president of the United States, but they see Harry. And essentially what you see through the discourse at the time is they fall in love with this guy. And it's a narrative. It begins and it builds and builds. And halfway through, they're like, you know what? America, his approval ratings are skyrocketing. The country is beginning to understand that they can trust this guy and they can get behind him. One of my favorite things about researching Truman, when I started this book, I had 2 little kids. I have a daughter who's 17 now. But I was so inspired by Truman's letters that exist between he and his daughter's memoirs. And we have his daughter's diaries. And I was able to meet Harry Truman's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, and talk to him about his mother, Margie, as Truman called it. And here you see this picture of him. And it says a lot. It says a lot about a human being. By the way, he treats women, particularly in this era. And that part of Truman really emerges in his letters to his daughter and his letters to his wife when he's traveling. And the meaning of family to him is so important. And I just found that extraordinarily inspiring. As we get toward the end of the 4 months, Truman realizes he's going to have to go on a trip, and it's going to be a rough one. He's still getting his feet under him, and he's communicating daily. All the communications, of course, exist in the National Archives and in the Truman Library. His cables to Churchill, Churchill's cables back, the communications with Stalin, they're extraordinary. These guys have to find common ground. They're allies to win a war, but as it appears that the war is going to end, their relationships are becoming strained because each is out for themselves, naturally. They're politicians, they're leaders of their countries and of their peoples. And that comfortable friendship just starts to become strained right about the time that Truman realizes, I got to go to Potsdam, I got to sit at the table, and we got to negotiate the future of the world between the three of us. Things get complicated because Churchill here is actually up for re-election when the Potsdam Conference begins. And there's really three narratives that I explore. Again, because there's so much documentation, the minutes of the plenary meetings, all the diaries of everybody is there, the official communications, Truman's letters, Truman's diaries. You can really get into the head of our main character, but also construct his daily life from minute to minute, this granular level of what his life was like, what the ship ride was like across the Atlantic, the preparations, the books that he read to prepare, prepared by the State Department, prepared by the military leaders, all of that exists. And they're fascinating documents, but they really help you understand what Truman's life was really like, down to the minute, and what he was facing at that time. Three narratives at the Potsdam Conference unfold. One is the plenary sessions. We have 3 minutes, 3 versions of the minutes of the meeting, the translated Russian, the British, and the American. They all say the same thing in different wording. But you see these guys duking it out. It becomes very contentious at times, particularly with the Soviets, but Truman holds his own. And, the American people are watching, and the world literally sort of hangs in the balance. The second narrative at the Potsdam Conference is the social scene. It's fascinating. It really riveted me. There are these great balls. Each of these 3 countries throws this giant ball, and we have the minutes, we have the menus, what was served at each, and how much did Churchill drink? What was Stalin drinking? He used to do all these shots of vodka, but the Americans quickly realized that it was just French wine because Stalin had a heart attack and he wasn't allowed to drink vodka. One of those American figures liberated a package of Stalin's cigarettes. And those cigarettes to this day are in the Truman Library. I've seen them. They have Soviet writing on them. And anyway, that's the second narrative. So the plenary sessions, the actual politics with the future of the world, the social scene is fascinating. And finally, behind the scenes, all happening at the same time, you have this. Truman finds out that the atomic bomb experiment is a success. So he gets this cable. We have, of course, the communications, and he finds out that the bomb is going to work. What else happens during this first 4 months? Well, we have the first atomic explosions, the only atomic weapons ever used on an enemy. Of course, you have Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You're looking at both of them. And last but not least, of course, you have the beginning of the Cold War. Something that happens at the Potsdam Conference. You can see this conflict begin to emerge between the Soviets and the Americans. Truman is duking it out with Stalin. Shouting matches, are happening before everybody in the room. It's pretty shocking. And the main thing that the United States and the Soviet Union cannot agree on is on the government of Poland. And some people today, when I talk about this, they're kind of shocked, like, that's really what started this whole thing? And kind of, yeah, it was the government of Poland that started the Cold War, if you think about it. We were demanding what we found, what we believe to be true in the Atlantic Charter. It's in the Atlantic Charter that a people of a nation should be able to go through the democratic process and choose their own leader. And the elections in Poland were a sham. The Soviets had put their own puppet government in there, and they refused to budge. The Soviets are thinking, Poland is this country that exists right next to the United States. Countless times, tribes have come through this frontier to attack Moscow. We're not having it. We're going to put our own puppet government in there. And from Stalin's point of view, he really can't understand why Truman thinks he should have any say in the matter. Truman is saying, well, we fought this war to liberate the countries under this and that, and we want democracy in these countries. We agreed on it, and that's what we're going to have. So Poland is going to have a free and fair election, and these two countries refuse to, they cannot come to terms, and they leave Potsdam apart on this issue. And really, when you talk about Ukraine these days, it's eerily similar. We believe that the government of Ukraine should exist and should be chosen by the Ukrainian people. The Soviets think otherwise. So just as it was then, it's still happening now. At that time, following Potsdam, of course, we saw the Cold War begin and Soviet influence proliferate across the East and Europe, and it was very scary. We don't want that to happen again. But anyway, that's what's happening then. Even at Potsdam, you see the beginning of the atomic arms race. So there's this little moment where, the American officials, they huddle and they say, well, we think that we need to share with Stalin that we have this secret weapon, because if we use it and he is not told, it's not going to bode well for the future. Our friendship and our trust, what little of it there is, will be destroyed. So we tell our people, Truman tells Stalin, well, we've got this bomb. And Stalin just nods his head. And as we know from documentation of the time, that they were already working on their own bomb. So what are the takeaways? I want people to walk away from this book. Hopefully you'll read it feeling something. I don't want you to just say, well, this happened on this date, and this happened on this date, and this happened on this date, and I learned that in AJ's book. The way I wrote this book, what I'm hoping people will do is experience not just what occurred, but what it felt like. Because the documentation is so voluminous, I want people to walk through Truman's shoes in this book, to experience what it was like to be the president of the United States at the critical moment of World War II, to what it was like to be the most powerful man in the world at the dawn of the atomic age. Another takeaway, I think that good leadership is obviously an important thing, but it's something we learn a lot about in this book. Truman, everybody expected him to fail. When I was growing up, my dad used to get psyched up. He ran marathons, and he would play the Rocky theme song and watch Rocky movies. And really, this is sort of like the global political Rocky experience of American presidents, in which you have this ultimate underdog, a man of the people who becomes president by mistake and really wins over the United States, wins over the people, and leads us out of the war. The buck stops here. At some point during the first 4 months of his administration, he puts this sign on the front of his desk. And I think through the example of Truman's leadership, we see something that we should see in all people who choose to be leaders, and that is responsibility, accountability. This was a man who was willing to fail for himself if it meant it could be better for the American people. And he took a lot of chances, and he came out on top. And last but not least, there's a lot about patriotism in here. There's a lot of times where Truman is really sharing his feeling about the country, his feeling about the United States, his feeling about the war, in his letters to his daughter, to his wife, in his diaries. And they're just so moving. It really is an example of good leadership and what love of country and service really means in a very practical way. So that is my presentation. I thank everybody for being with me. I'm excited to take some questions. I hope I can answer them intelligently, and thank you again.
I have to say, I'm a very big fan. I love the way you write. I think you are the definition of someone who can take history and make it supremely human and fascinating. I'm a huge, huge fan anyway. And there are lots of reasons why I'm a fan, and I've got some of my markers in your book. Hey, can you see that? I do my homework. For you, I've done my homework. Put it that way.
That's brilliant.
But you say something really important here. Now, we have a whole bunch of questions and not much time, but you say something really important here that I think that we need to emphasize over and over again about the end of World War II. You say the United States had provided soldiers and a great majority of the tools of war that destroyed Nazism and saved Europe. Okay, that's all. Remember this. Okay, the Brits, the Canadians, the Red Army, the Soviets. It was absolutely critical. The involvement of the United States was absolutely critical to any of those nations claiming victory at the end of the war. The essential nation in terms of victory was the United States. I'm sorry, that's just the way it was. Anyway, you carry on. The United States had defeated a Japanese military intent on dominating all of the Far East. In the eyes of the world, this was America's finest hour. Never before had the United States achieved such prestige. What Truman did not know at this moment was this: never would the United States achieve such prestige again. And we wonder why we all feel nostalgic about that era of World War II. Yeah, okay, thank you again. I'm going to go to the questions now, but I think that was important to point that out. Lots of comments, outstanding pictures that helped illustrate the story, which was beautifully told. First question is from Julie. Was there any mention in Roosevelt's diary about why he picked Truman? Roosevelt obviously saw his greatness. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Absolutely. So this is a question I get quite often because how is it that Truman became the accidental president? It's really uncanny. Uncanny is the word, and it's a little bit inexplicable. So we go deep in the book about how it happened, and there's this amazing. I love scene setting because I'm an HBO kid. Like when I grew up, I was the first generation to grow up with cable TV where I could watch, movies over and over again. And to me, scene setting and dialogue is critical, and that's why the documentation that we have is so important because you can really put a person in the room. And there's this meeting in Roosevelt's White House. Everybody's smoking cigarettes, and they're trying to figure out who the vice president is going to be for 44. And there's a problem with everybody. Jimmy Burns. Jimmy Burns was the most qualified. Everybody knew Jimmy Burns. But he had a problem. African American voters were not going to vote for Jimmy Burns because he was from South Carolina and he had said some things that a lot of black people in America didn't appreciate. Just as one example of all these different candidates who just were way more qualified, and way more safer bets than this guy Truman. And Truman just falls into place because he's somebody who doesn't seem to have any enemies. He's the one guy who's not going to offend any small part of the electorate. And so he ends up there sort of by mistake. And the conversations in that smoky room in the White House that night are really fascinating. But what happens is Truman ends up on the ticket, and the person who's most surprised is Harry Truman himself, because he goes to the conference and, to the Democratic National Convention with a speech prepared to nominate James Burns. And there he goes, and all of a sudden he's on the ticket, and he's the most shocked of all. When he finds out he's actually eating a hot dog at a hot dog stand, and there's this voice saying, "Would Harry Truman please come to the stage? Would Harry Truman?" And he's got a hot dog in his hand. He's shocked. He didn't expect this to happen.
We have a really good question here from another one of our great viewers. Truman was not a political innocent. His relationship with the corrupt leader of Kansas City Democratic machine, Tom Pendergast, reveals his ambition and willingness to engage in the dark side of politics. Can you comment on that? I mean, that's an assertion, but can you comment on this somewhat darker allegation?
Yes, it's a great question, and I appreciate it very much. One of my favorite parts of research in this book, when Truman first goes to Washington, he's running for Senate. He keeps this diary, and anybody who knows anything about Truman knows that he loves to drink bourbon. And he used to check into this room at I believe it's called the Pickwick Hotel in Kansas City, And he had this stationery from the hotel, and he kept a diary on it. And in that diary, he's realizing like I'm actually, I might actually get elected to Senate. I might actually go to Washington, D.C. And he, in that diary, confronts all the things that he had learned about politics and the dark side of politics and what politicians have to do sometimes in order to not just win elections, but for the greater good. And so he confronts the dark side of politics, and we have those diaries. You can see him talking about money and knowing when crimes have happened and how to deal with that as a person who's trying to fight for the greater good and finding the moral compass within himself. And he's writing these diaries at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the honesty of them is fascinating. So I encourage people, this section of the book is called The Political Education of Harry Truman, where he confronts that. Yeah, because he did come to power through the help of a guy named Pendergast, who was a total crook and who went to prison. And he's not exactly an entirely innocent figure, but I love the fact that he confronts this, and we have the documentation of what he's thinking about it and what his goals are in the end. Yeah.
Another question here, and I have to speed through a few. I'm sorry. You said that there was a moment that the public starts to relate to Truman after Roosevelt's death. Can you talk about the psychology of that? And she adds the question, my mother, who is listening too, remembers FDR as the president, the only one she knew. Is the public finding a home in Truman because he is more like them than the great FDR, or is it something else that the public relates to?
I think that's a lot of it. And that's why in my talk, I talked a little bit about the idea that people are starting to see that this guy is not just the president of the United States, he's Harry. He's a person that they can relate to. He's a guy who goes for walks in the morning around, Washington, D.C. and goes to the drugstore and gets medicine for his wife. He's just this sort of normal guy. Um, and the psychology of it, you can see this. I use the word narrative in the talk we just did, but you can see through particularly all kinds of different sources this narrative build of this guy. First, there's the shock, like, who is this guy? We don't know who he is. Is he going to protect us? Are we going to win the war? And through this 4 months, and you see how he's reacting, and he becomes a leader before the American people and before the world, but also a very relatable human being. And so he sort of becomes a folk hero in the middle of all this. And you can see it in the documentation. I'm just trying to remember, I can almost quote it exactly. This newspaper article that I found that just talks about exactly this. And it's a columnist, and he's talking about how everybody in America seems to feel warm. Suddenly, people are saying hello to strangers and smiling because there's this inspiration of warmth and trustworthiness in the president that's trickling down to the American people.
You know what's amazing about this show and Friends is that we actually have a viewer who was there at the great and important meeting of the Russians and the Americans at the Elbe. Colonel Cohn is with us. So you are actually talking to us and also a real participant at a great moment in history that you mentioned in your book, Colonel Cohn. That's big shout out to that great veteran, Battle of the Bulge veteran who saw so much of history. So thank you, Colonel Cohn, for being with us.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you for your service, Colonel. That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful to have that? So another question, how did Truman feel about civil rights? This is a very broad question, but it's one that I think we need to talk about a little bit because he did have a huge impact on the civil rights movement.
That's a great question. So I wrote, it's kind of a sequel. I also have my little tabs, but this is a book about the 1948 election. That takes place right after this book, so they kind of go together. But in Dewey Defeats Truman, I go deep. I talk a lot about civil rights because in the 1948 election, it's a major theme. And really, to sum it all up, and I think a lot of people listening today know this, is that Truman was an extraordinary hero for just
for civil rights in America, desegregated the military, and was voting rights was a major issue. You had the Supreme Court decision Smith versus Allwright in 1944. So Truman's going to run for president and try to win the presidency on his own. Because remember, he fell into the presidency in 1945. So he goes out in 48 and he wants to win. And he's looking at the political landscape at the time, the first election in the post-war world, the first election in the atomic age, the first election in the television age, and the first election after Smith versus Allwright, where he realizes that black voting power is going to be really, really important, maybe not in 1948, but in the future. And he goes way out on a limb to fight for voting rights. He campaigns in Harlem, which had never happened before. He goes and speaks in the spiritual Mecca of Black America. And I think that civil rights leaders can really draw a lot of the movement from the point of view of mainstream American politics right into Truman's Oval Office.
Another question here, and it's actually something that we should all dwell on is his humility. One of the things I find most attractive about Truman is that he was so humble. One favorite fact, this is from Tess, one favorite fact of Harry Truman is when his presidency was over, Truman just got in his car and drove home to Missouri. No Secret Service. Is that true? Is that true?
I believe that it's true, and there's a
Right.
book about that. I think it's called Harry Truman's Great Adventure. He goes traveling. There's this one anecdote that I love. He gets pulled over by a policeman, and the police officer looks at the guy. He's writing a ticket, and the police officer says, "You look a lot like Harry Truman," because the police officer can't believe that this guy driving a car he just pulled over is actually the former president. But I love the idea of his humility. I'll just say one thing. When you're writing a story, you either want everybody to get behind your main character, to pull for your main character, or you want your main character to be just someone who's just tremendously loathsome so that people continue the story because they want to see that person crushed and become miserable. But Truman was a figure where it was easy to write about in so much as that he's such a likable character. I have to be careful. There's a word called hagiography. People pronounce that word differently, but it basically means biography in which the writer adores the subject. I'm careful not to write hagiography because he was a human being. He did make mistakes. He did explore and come from, to some degree, the dark side of politics, as we discussed. But he's ultimately a really likable character, and a lot of that has to do with his humility.
Um, Blaine is echoing what I'm thinking right now, which is she likes the wide range of topics of books on the shelves behind you. She's mislabeled you a professor, but we'll forgive that. But she likes the books on your shelves behind you. I just wanted to ask one question. We have a lot of comments. People can read those in the chat column. But I'd like you to sum up to us what the significance of Truman is to you personally, and how important this book was for you. Why you chose this? It's a brilliant segment of an amazing man's life. But what's the significance of this chapter in American history and in terms of your own life?
That's a great question. I feel that, well, there's so many different ways to answer that question. And one way to answer it is I have two children, one is 17 and one is 20. And when I look at the way they look at the world, it does concern me that history, in a sense of the past, is disappearing. And it makes me very, very nervous because I think that these events are so critical. And once we lose track of what happened and why it happened, we run the risk as a human people of humanity of making huge mistakes again. Truman wrote that history repeats itself. And he said early in his life, he never graduated college, but he was extraordinarily educated. And that was through his own reading. And he discovered in his reading that history repeats itself. And if you have a good understanding of history, um, you can see political situations or situations that are before us now that have happened in the past. And you can see the mistakes that were made. And that way, with a knowledge of history, make sure that we don't make those mistakes again. One of the scariest things I've ever seen in my life are the statistics of people who think that the Holocaust never happened. That's terrifying. And it's super important that young people, the next generations, have at least a rudimentary understanding of what happened in the past, how it happened, why it happened, so those kinds of mistakes don't happen again. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, you did so very well. And I should stress that friends, at the core of our mission is this desire, burning desire to make sure that young Americans do understand what happened back in World War II, not only in terms of not repeating the mistakes of the past, but also of knowing what it is to be American and feeling good about that. That one of the things I want to finish with is by stressing to you and to our viewers that this is a really inspirational book. I find this a truly inspirational read. Obviously, he was human, he had flaws, but if you really want to look at a chapter in American history and a character in American history who seemed to embody everything that we want to admire and love about this country, it's this guy. It's this accidental president. So I want to thank you so much, AJ, for joining us. You're very welcome to come to DC. I'll take you around the memorial, take you out for dinner. We'd love to hang out with you. Please rejoin us. And I really want to thank you for your time this morning. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
I am so honored that when I first heard that you had invited me, I'm so honored. I would love any way I can be of help. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for your service, Colonel. I'm very honored to have you with us today. And I'm just so appreciative. Thank you.